Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Ryan Pronzinski of Christ Lutheran Church in Michigan Center, Michigan, and this is my Chair Chat daily devotion for Monday, May 18, 2020. Peace be with you. These devotions are intended to help you engage your life of faith during this time of pandemic. With that in mind, I encourage you to take time throughout these videos to pause them, reflect, journal, maybe even have conversation with those around you, with family, friends, whoever you might be staying with and viewing these with at the time. If you're not with someone, I also encourage you to leave constructive comments, questions, or prayer requests in the comments section below, and I promise that I will get to these in the following videos, as I've done in the past. The readings that are put forth every day in these videos come from the Daily Revised Common Lectionary, which is a church calendar reading schedule, and it can be found online. The readings for today are Psalm 93, Genesis 9 verses 8 through 17, which is kind of a semi-continuation and a bit of a conclusion for the readings from May 14 through 16. And then lastly, we have Acts chapter 27 verses 39 through 44, which is also a semi-continuation and conclusion from the readings on May 14 through May 15. So we get Noah's story coming to an end, and we get Paul's sailing story coming to an end today. Before I get to the readings themselves, as always, I like to invite any of you who view these videos to come and join us at Christ Lutheran Church for our Sunday morning worship service. We live stream our services at 9:45 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on our Facebook page, and the link to those videos can be found in the description below. And just so I don't forget, the readings as well that I said out loud can also be found in the description below, so you can look those up. I think that's all that I have for you before I get to the first reading. So yeah, again, all are welcome to watch our services on Sunday. If you can't make it for the live stream, they are posted after the fact, and you can watch them then. In fact, this Sunday's service is actually going to be pre-recorded, as my two helpers will be on vacation out of town this weekend. All right, so on to Psalm 93, which reads as follows. The Lord is king. He is robed in majesty. The Lord is robed. He is girded with strength. He established the world, and it shall never be moved. Your throne is established from of old. You are from everlasting. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring. More majestic than the thunders of these mighty waters, more majestic than the waves of the sea, majestic on high is the Lord. Your decrees are very sure. Holiness befits your house, O Lord, forevermore. Here ends the reading. Well, I'll share what my initial thoughts were, but as I read this the second time now, with all the readings in mind, these are stories about water. At least the next two will be, and how water can be very scary and dangerous and cause a lot of harm and destruction and death. And here the psalmist reminds us that more majestic and strong and sure is God and God's presence and God's love than all the chaos in that around us. And so my initial thought is in line with that, but just want to state that, because the line that really stood out to me this morning was, quote, He established the world, and it shall never be moved. That is, the Lord established the world, and it shall never be moved. That's the end of verse 1. And right now we are living in a time when our worlds, and I use this somewhat metaphorically, that is our ways of being and living, they seem to be crumbling around us, right? Of course, during this time in the year, there's usually a lot of graduation ceremonies and celebrations, and a lot of that stuff's not happening, and those are really big things. And so that way of doing things is kind of crumbling. I mean, I watched a graduation ceremony on Facebook Live because I wasn't able to actually go and attend it. But what's interesting, though, is on the flip side, the rest of the literal world, like the physical, tangible creation around us, honestly is doing quite well, and in a lot of ways is doing better than it has in a long time. And we at Christ Lutheran Church actually have a sign of how well life is doing in our very own parking lot, where we actually right now, today, although I haven't seen it today, but I did yesterday, we have a mother duck who laid a nest of eggs right beside the bush just outside our main doors. So if you were to come out the main doors, there's an awning, a big awning, and then some steps that lead down to the parking lot, and then next to those steps on either side is a nice little landscaping area with some bushes or a bush, and behind the one bush on the right hand side, I think, yes, as you're walking to the doors, there's a mama duck and a nest full of eggs, right? And normally there would be people, constant foot traffic walking in and out of these doors throughout the week. You know, we have community dinners, we have other people that rent out the community center that they get to through these doors, all sorts of activity, right? And so I imagine that any mama duck in their right mind would see all this foot traffic, all the cars, all the commotion going on around these doors, and would never in their right mind think to have their nest and their eggs in this spot. But at this time when almost no one is going in and out of these doors, I don't. I go in through the other door on the other end of the building by the office. Her nest is actually in a pretty great spot if you take people away from the scenario, because it's behind a bush, right? So it's not easy to see. You have to be at the right angle, and then you can kind of see her head poking out the one side. And it's under the canopy of our building, so it's out of the rain. So she's not getting wet. Trying to build a nest, underneath any trees or anything is not going to be perfect. And so that nice constructed canopy is keeping her and her eggs dry as she has to sit on top of them. And then the other beautiful thing is that there's ample water right nearby, because we have a stream or a tributary or maybe even a part of the Grand River itself that runs right underneath our parking lot. And so what an awesome spot for this mama duck to be. And so with that in mind, to me the mama duck and her soon-to-be baby ducks are a reminder that even though our worlds are being shaken and crumble, and maybe even they're a little broken, they may not come back to the way they were in some ways, God's world, like the world, is not shaken. It's still here. The sun is still technically shining, even though it's a cloudy, rainy day today. And our world is still full of majestic, wonderful, beautiful things, and is full of life. And our everlasting, majestic God will be with us in this world always. Right? To me, this mama duck and baby ducks are a sign of that. And God will be with us, making sure that we, along with the world, will not be shaken to the point of death. Because I know even for mama ducks, some places, I'm sure their world is being shaken a little bit. Not everything goes perfectly for all creatures all the time. But that mama duck is acting as a sign. And as I was walking into the church on Sunday, I even saw a hawk overhead, soaring and roaming and looking for food. And so I saw a mama duck, I saw this hawk, I saw a lot of our trees that have flowers on them, budding and sprouting, and it was just beautiful. And it's just a reminder that the world is continuing to flourish, and we are a part of that world. And although our part of it doesn't feel like it's flourishing, God is our God. God is your God. God will not let us be shaken to the point of death. So what signs of God's firm established foundational goodness, right, have you seen in the world lately? For me, it's the mama duck, it's the hawk, it's the beautiful flowering trees. What have you seen? And how might seeing this majestic goodness, and then knowing, as the Bible tells us, that God knows every hair on your head and knows you by name, You small little speck in the universe of things, how might knowing that the world, the creation is so majestic and big and grand and full of life, and that God knows every hair on your head, knows you by name, how might this truth help give you hope today? Right? That as you see all the beauty and all the goodness around you in different ways, to know that you are a part of that goodness too, and God cares equally, if not more, in some ways about you. All right, on to Genesis 9, 8-17. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as have come out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood. And never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you, for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and all the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I, God, will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never rise again and become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. Here ends the reading. So as I think I said earlier, here we have kind of the conclusion to the Noah story of sorts. There's a little bit more about Noah, but this kind of ends the flood portion of it, right? After the waters recede, God establishes a covenant. And for you that aren't terribly familiar with that word, in brief, it's a relational, binding commitment of promise. You might think of a covenant as something like a covenant of marriage. Even if you want to think of it colder, it's generally more relational, but even something like a mortgage or a bank loan. It's an agreement between two parties. But in the Bible, it tends to be more relational between either people or God and people. And it's binding. It's a promise. And so today we have this binding relational promise between God and all of creation for all future generations. So that means quite literally, not in some implicit way, but in a very explicit way, God is saying that this promise is for you and for me, period. There's no arguing that. And it's a promise from God to you and all living things that God will not utterly destroy you or anything in all creation ever again. Which we often forget. This is the implicit message behind that. Although it's explicitly stated earlier in Genesis, you see God's desire for all creation, and it has been so from the very beginning, which includes you and I, is a desire for life. God wants you to live, and not to simply live, but to live life abundantly, right? God says, be fruitful and multiply. That's how good you are. You are so good, God wants to see more of you. And so the rainbow is a sign of this desire and promise from God. So as it rains today here in Jackson, Michigan, I don't know if it'll be raining where you are when you watch this, I hope you see some rainbows today. I really do. And now with the promise of abundant life symbolized by the rainbow in mind, for that's indeed what it symbolizes, God's promise and desire for abundant life for you and all creation, I want you to actually think about a rainbow right now, like the actual thing, how it's shaped. Picture that rainbow right now in your mind, how it's shaped like an arc. Now I want you to notice that the text calls the rainbow simply bow. That's it. It's just bow. I have placed my bow in the sky. For in Hebrew, that is the actual word. We in English have the word rainbow, but if you look at where this word pops up in Hebrew throughout the rest of the Old Testament, everywhere else it's simply a bow, and the context of it is quite literally in the, strung arrow, weapon of war, bow. And so I actually have that. So what shape is a bow, right? It's also arc-shaped. So I say all this because this is important. God is quite literally saying in this promise, this binding relational promise to you and to I, that God is hanging up God's bow, God's weapon of war and death, permanently. It's up in the sky. And if you think again on a rainbow in the sky and you can picture it, what direction, right, is that bow facing? It's facing upward, right? It's facing toward God. And so the rainbow literally shows us, if we think of it as a bow, as a weapon of war, that no arrows from God will ever head our direction or in the direction of creation ever again. I hope, as I say all that with you, you will never look at a rainbow the same ever again. God has hung up God's weapon of war and desires for nothing but peace and abundant life for you. That is the promise of the rainbow. And so as I finish saying all that about bows, I am kind of left wondering this, though, in our time, in our place, in our lives, in your life. What things might God be calling us to hang up right now, as God hung up God's bow in the story today, in order that life can prosper? That was the whole point, right? So that life can prosper. And I know that oftentimes words can be used as weapons, right? There is a statement of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. That is the biggest lie on the planet it's the biggest lie on this planet. Sticks and stones may show the wounds, but words damage underneath, and they do a lot of damage. And so words can be used as weapons, especially if they make us as people feel secure as we use them. Right? Often we as human beings bring others down because it makes us feel better, feel superior, feel secure, maybe even a little smug or self-righteous because, they should have known better. I never would have done something like that. How foolish of them. And we can tear people down, whether in their presence or in their absence, with our words. And at a time when many are scared, depressed, confused, grieving, and as a consequence, angry, because anger is a secondary emotion. It stems from all of these things, being scared, depressed, confused, grieving. Might we need to hang up certain words or phrases or ways of talking about people right now? Might we need to hang those things up? Might we need to be a little bit more gentle, not just with others, but even with ourselves, how we think about and talk about ourselves? Especially like with how we speak about others and ourselves. You see, rainbows are also a beautiful metaphor, right? Rainbows are beautiful because they are diverse but unified. If a rainbow was all one color, it would just be this big splotch in the sky. It wouldn't be a rainbow. And what makes a rainbow so beautiful is its diversity and yet its unity. It is all these different colors together, working together in the same movement, in harmony with one another. And so I wonder, how might our words, your words, this week help bring together and build up the people around you, just like a rainbow, right? A rainbow which both promises and gives life. It's not just a promise of, but as we view it and we take notice of it, it's life-giving in and of itself, even if we don't ever get to the promise that's behind it. So that's plenty to think about with regard to Noah and the rainbow and the end of that story. So on to Acts chapter 27, verses 39 through 44. In the morning they did not recognize the land, that is, Paul and all the compatriots who are on this boat, Paul as a prisoner with many others on their way to Rome. And after several days of storms, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned to run the ship ashore if they could. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea. They found another thing to cast off. That's remarkable. At the same time, they loosened the ropes and tied the steering oars, then hoisted the foresail to the wind. They made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the ship aground. The bow struck and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the force of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none might swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. The centurion ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest to follow, some on planks and others on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. Here ends the reading. So there is a really beautiful sequence that takes place in kind of the end of this sailing story with Paul in Acts 27. And it goes like this. 1, the people do not recognize where they are or where they're going. The people do not recognize where they are or where they're going. 2, the next thing that happens is the people's situation is constantly changing and they are frequently having to adapt. The people's situation is constantly changing and they are frequently having to adapt. And lastly, all are brought safely to their destination, despite not knowing where they are or where they're going, and constantly having to change and adapt. Now, as I broke this part of Acts 27 down into 3 parts like that, I hope you are hearing our own story today, right? Oftentimes, a narrative story, even if it's historical and factual, as a story can still function metaphorically, right? Because we, like the people in the story today, in many ways, we don't recognize where we are, right? No one has ever lived through face masks and 6-foot distancing and widespread closures to public gatherings. I mean, this is just strange stuff that we have never had to do. We don't recognize this. This is not recognizable. We, like the people in the story today, in many ways, don't know exactly where we are going. When exactly do we reopen businesses, schools, churches, etc.? And how exactly do we do this? And for how long do we put all these measures in place? Do we ever get back to a quote-unquote normal? No one has these answers quite yet. At least not definitively and not uniformly. And it's all, a lot of it's up in the air. And so that's point 1 of not knowing where we are or where we're going. We kind of have an idea, like in the story, but we're just kind of like, all right, let's try and make it through this storm. And so, as a consequence, like in the story, we, like the people in the story today, are constantly dealing with a changing situation and having to adapt. If you have not had to adapt your life at all through this pandemic, God bless you. That is awesome. I am so thankful for you today, and I hope that it continues to be peaceful for you, and I hope you can share that peace with others. But I imagine that's not true. And just to give you an example of adapting and changing, just a couple months ago, I was keeping up with the live testimony of the epidemiologists and CDC people, and I heard a former CDC head say live that face masks for general use in the public was a bad idea. because people would touch their face too much, and then it would also take away the masks from healthcare workers who needed them more. Fast forwarding to now it's recommended by Anthony Fauci, who's kind of like the spearhead right now of all of this, that everyone, including I think even the director of the CDC right now, everyone should wear masks when out in public. Now, granted, they're saying cloth coverings so as not to take away the masks from the healthcare workers, but still, we kind of go from a pretty strong message of don't worry about it. In fact, it might actually be harmful to, yes, everybody should be wearing these because it will actually help prevent the spread of the disease. All within 2 months. In human history, I mean, that's pretty quick. And so this is along with Zoom meetings, Zoom classes, Zoom concerts, yes, Zoom concerts, Zoom fellowship hours. My colleagues are doing that. I don't quite understand how that works. We're having enough difficulty just doing meetings, let alone trying to do a coffee hour after church with Zoom. And more. So many adaptations and changes we're having to make. And so I hope very easily you are seeing how we fit into the first 2 points of this story from Acts. Not knowing where we are, not knowing where we're going, and everything's always changing and we're always having to adapt. That feels like our life right now. Which means, though, that if we fit into those first 2 points in this arc of the story, it means we fit into the last point as well. And this is the most important point. We, like the people in the story today, will arrive safely at our destination. We will end up where we need to be. Even amidst much damage and loss, right? They lose, by the end of the story, the entire ship. First, it was about leaving as early as possible from where they were before this so that they could make as much money as they could, right? They didn't want to stay wherever the harbor was where they were because it wasn't good enough for the winter. And so they were trying to, the owner of the ship and the captain were like, let's go. And then at first they're like, well, we'll just dump the cargo. And then it was like, we'll dump this. Then we'll dump that. I mean, they were throwing stuff over. And then, last week it was, and then finally they gave up all hope. They literally jettisoned hope. Today they're jettisoning anchors. The whole ship fell apart, right? Even amidst all this damage and loss, the end of the story is that the people arrive safely where they need to be. And the last point I want to leave you with is that this preservation of life, because that's what it is, and it's not a perfect preservation. There is damage and there is loss, just like in our own situation. But this preservation of life on a whole happens, of course, because of God's goodness and grace. God is with them. But notice that this preservation of life in the story today, for all the people on the ship, happens through just one person. One person is the linchpin in it all, and that is Paul. And I quote, "The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners," that includes Paul, and everyone else other than the Romans, "so that none might swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan." Paul, prior to this reading today, had been the one guiding and directing people and letting them know that God was going to keep them safe. Again, Paul's life, and by extension everyone else's, is threatened. And yet, through Paul and this centurion's relationship with Paul, one person, everyone is saved. Everyone arrives safely. And why I bring this point up is many people often think that they can't do much because, I'm only one person. But you know what? Paul was only one person in the story today. And I know that we go, he's the Apostle Paul. But look, I want you to think about this in terms of his situation in the story. Okay, not as you think of Paul, but as Paul actually is in this story. Because not only is he not just a regular Joe person, nor is he this, the Apostle Paul that we might, hold him up to. Paul's a prisoner. He's less than a nobody. He's a prisoner on a boat. He wasn't a celebrity with special status. He wasn't a great military leader or merchant with a bunch of connections. right? Or clout or influence. No, Paul was a prisoner, period. And he was actually on his way pretty much to get sentenced to death. He was less than nobody. But, wherever Paul was, and in this story that meant on this boat with these other prisoners and these Roman soldiers, Paul loved everyone, and with great passion. And Paul loved all the people around him. And so as a consequence, the centurion wanted to keep Paul alive. And thus, everyone was spared, because you can't just save Paul. He was a prisoner too. If you save one prisoner, you got to save them all. And so you, like Paul, are a person who can love the people around you with great passion too. You are empowered by the very same Holy Spirit that empowered Paul to help people to better, safer shores too. So I encourage you to love who you can, how you can, as much as you comfortably are able, right? Because we all need rest too. But love who you can, how you can, as much as you comfortably are able. And then trust that as you do, God is working through you to bring us, you, and the people around you, and the people of this world to better shores past this pandemic. And with that last point of hope in mind, I say to you, I will talk to you tomorrow.